Hello, everyone. This is Sarah from the Wings office. I'm the network coordinator here at Wings, and we're going to begin our webinar, Tech, Philanthropy, and Civil Society. This is the first part of a series called Disruptive Tech and Philanthropy. Today, we're going to learn more about the potential of technology in influencing philanthropy and where philanthropy support organizations fit into this discussion. This webinar will help all levels of philanthropy practitioners grapple with basic terminologies and concepts that could affect the field and civil society in the future. A few points on using WebEx before we begin. Please make sure you're connected to audio. You can do this by going to the upper left-hand corner to Quick Start. There will be 3 circles. Click on the far left circle that says Connect to Audio and connect using computer. If you have any questions at any point during the conversation, you can go to the chat box in the upper right-hand corner and send your questions to me, the host, Wings office, and I'll make sure to answer them to ask them on your behalf during our question and answer portion of the call. We'll also be unmuting people so you can ask your questions directly to Rodri. If you're calling using a telephone, please make sure to use a landline to ensure call clarity. And if at any point you get disconnected from the internet, you can log back into this call by clicking on the link that I sent earlier. This webinar will be available on our website or on our YouTube channel, Wings on the Air, later on today and starting next week. So welcome to Tech, Philanthropy, and Civil Society, a webinar co-hosted with CAF. Without further ado, I introduce you to Rodri Davies, who works at CAF as the head of policy. And he also leads Giving Thought, CAF's in-house think tank focusing on current and future issues affecting philanthropy and civil society. Rodri, I'm handing off the ball to you so you can start the presentation.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Sarah. I hope everybody can hear me well at this point. Obviously, let me know if you have any problems. Just as a bit of background before I get going on the content of the webinar, it's probably worth just saying a little bit about why I'm here talking to you about these issues to do with disruptive technology and philanthropy. As Sarah said, I'm head of policy at Charity Aid Foundation, which, if you don't know it, is a UK-based registered charity, an NGO, with an office of 9 partners around the world as well. And I work in the public policy side of things, and I particularly run a thing called Giving Thought, which is our in-house think tank, which is a space we've carved out to look at policy issues affecting philanthropy and civil society from a longer term and bigger picture perspective. And one of the areas that we've been focusing on a lot over the last 4 years, and even more so in the last year or 18 months, is the impact of a range of disruptive technologies on philanthropy and the work of civil society organizations, which is an issue that only seems to be getting more important as we move forward. So without further ado, I'm going to get going on the content of the presentation. So those of you who've taken the time to dial into the webinar might already feel as though you know why you think disruptive technology is relevant to your work, but I think it's worth, before we even start, taking a step back and just asking a question about why it is that funders and civil society organizations, I think, should care about this stuff. And I think there's at least kind of 3 top-line reasons that make a good case for it. And as you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, I think these go from broadly good through neutral down to negative. So the first one is that some of these technologies offer exciting new ways of achieving your mission as an organization. And this is probably where a lot of the focus has been so far in terms of talking about disruptive technology and philanthropy. Around the idea of the Tech for Good movement, which is taking these new technologies and applying them to the work of civil society to find new ways of delivering social and environmental impact. And there are some absolutely fascinating examples of that, which we might be able to come on to in the discussion at the end. And then the second, more neutral reason I think organizations should pay attention is that a lot of these technologies are so disruptive to the way organizations operate and even entire industries that they will have a very profound impact on the operating environment for civil society organizations and philanthropic funders themselves. And I'll be going into some detail around the impact of a couple of specific technologies in this webinar. And then the final reason, the more negative one, that I increasingly think is very important, and I think is one of the reasons that no one can afford to ignore the conversation about the impact of technology on philanthropy, even if you yourself don't feel like it's something you actively want to pursue, is that a lot of these technologies have very profound societal and environmental impacts that are going to create new problems that organizations like yours are probably going to be called upon to address in the future. So I would argue it's important to understand at least the key issues so that you're in a position to do that. Just a quick word on what I mean here to make a bit of a differentiation. When I'm talking about disruptive technology, I don't really mean the kind of straightforward, digital agenda around how to use the internet more effectively. The internet is definitely a disruptive technology, but in a way it's a disruptive technology from 20 years ago. I think what I'm trying to focus on is what are the technologies that will cause the next big disruptions. And by disruption, I mean something that doesn't just alter in a small way existing ways of doing things, but fundamentally changes the paradigm, so you have to do entirely new things. And just a few examples on this slide of the kinds of things that I'm talking about here, and you may well have heard of plenty of these because a lot of them have become quite big topics of mainstream conversation. So, for example, things that we'll be talking about today, artificial intelligence, or AI, is very much in the news at the moment, and I'll be coming on to some of the impacts of that later on. Blockchain technology, and one of its specific use cases, cryptocurrency, which again, I'll be covering both of those as examples later on. Big or open data, perhaps not a technology in itself, but increasingly data is the fuel that is driving a lot of these new technologies. The Economist quite recently, for instance, said that data is the new oil. And that's an idea that we're going to see, I think, repeated elsewhere a lot over the coming years. The Internet of Things, which is the idea of the huge interconnected network of smart objects. So this is objects that have embedded sensors and processors which are able to react to their environment and adapt and communicate with each other. So, Wi-Fi enabled domestic appliances or potentially autonomous vehicles or buildings. And some of these others, I won't go into a huge amount of detail here, but just examples of other things that fit within this to give you a sense of how much technological disruption there is at the moment. Virtual and augmented reality, autonomous vehicles I've already mentioned, 3D printing, again, a very disruptive technology potentially. Robotics has been around for many years, but recent advances mean that we're potentially on the cusp of that, creating huge disruption to labor and the workforce. Wearable technology, CRISPR and biotech, which is something that I'm not going to go into in any detail in this particular webinar, but is a whole other area that I think is absolutely fascinating and quite different from a lot of the digital technologies that we often focus on. Human augmentation, so the combination of digital or biotechnology within the human body, and quantum computing, which is something that is still quite largely theoretical, but we're starting to see big companies beginning to implement and could potentially have some very interesting implications. And then I think just to sort of set a bit of a framework before I go into some specific examples, I think that there are a range of key questions that civil society and civil society organizations and funders need to ask when it comes to looking at these disruptive technologies. And I'll put some of these on this slide to give you an idea of the sorts of things I mean. So firstly, as I've mentioned, could it create new ways for existing civil society organizations to solve problems? So that's the kind of positive tech for good spin. Could it create new challenges for your existing beneficiaries? So some of these technologies are already starting to cause problems for particular individuals and communities, and organizations that seek to serve those need to understand those developments, I think. Could it create entirely new problems that civil society may have to address in the future? Could it disrupt existing governance structures of civil society organizations? And I'll come on to how that might happen when I talk about blockchain technologies in a minute. Could it lead to not just new governance structures within civil society, but entirely new types of organizations emerging to compete with existing civil society organizations? So we're already seeing the encroachment of commercial enterprises onto the social good space in the shape of things like B corporations. And I think in the future it will be even more the case that doing social and environmental good isn't seen as the preserve of charitable organizations or civil society organizations. And I think technology will enable the creation of even more types of organizations in the future. A key question, I think, and a big picture one is, will this technology reduce or will it increase inequality? And there I'm talking about existing income equality or inequality of opportunity, but also potentially new types of inequality caused by the technology itself. For instance, simply access to the technology. The UN, for instance, in 2016 made access to the internet a basic human right, and it's arguable now that lack of access to the internet creates huge inequality between those who have it and those who don't, and the same will be true of other technologies. And then some other questions here, just examples which I won't go into in any detail. At this point, what I want to do is kind of take some of these questions and then apply them to a couple of specific technologies to give you an idea of the sort of work I've been doing and where I think some of these conversations need to go. So the first one I want to look at is cryptocurrency and blockchain technology, which is very much in the news for better and worse over the last year or so. And I want to look primarily at blockchain technology in the round, although I will look briefly at cryptocurrency as a specific use case of it, because I think there are some particular points to be made. So just a bit of terminology for anybody who hasn't really read about any of this before. And I will admit it's difficult to give a very, very short description of blockchain technology. It is quite a complex back office infrastructure technology, and I'm not going to go into any detail about how it works. I'll do my best just to give you the key features that I think help you hopefully understand some of the potential opportunities and challenges. But just a brief idea of what it is. A blockchain is a distributed public ledger. So the idea is that it's a ledger, so it's a record of transactions and ownership within a system. But the key difference between this kind of ledger and a traditional ledger is that it is distributed across all the people who are members of the system. So all of them potentially have responsibility for maintaining copies of that ledger. So what you don't need is a traditional single third-party intermediary like a bank or a central bank or a governmental agency. It's important to say that blockchain is not the same thing as Bitcoin. The two are often talked about in the same context because Bitcoin is the best known use case of blockchain, but Bitcoin and cryptocurrency more widely is just one use case, and there are far wider potential applications of blockchain that I think are probably more relevant for civil society. Just to get a sense of why that is, in terms of non-financial blockchain uses, the idea of a new type of ledger, essentially a glorified spreadsheet, might sound quite boring in a lot of ways. But actually, when you think about it, trustworthy record keeping is absolutely fundamental to a huge number of areas of our life. So you can see here on the slide the invention of double-entry bookkeeping in the mid-1400s in Florence was the start of the modern financial system as we know it today. And that has now morphed into all sorts of areas of our life. So here are just some examples, particularly UK ones, it has to be said, but things like registering charitable organisations, credit scoring, health records, owning a vehicle, land registry for property, voter registration. All of these rely fundamentally on having trustworthy records and ledgers of who is who and how they have interacted with each other and with the system. So a change to the way that ledgers work is pretty important. Just to go back a second and to talk specifically about cryptocurrency. So as I say, you've probably heard of Bitcoin because that's by far the best known one, but it's worth saying there are well over 1,000 cryptocurrencies on the market now. I think there's somewhere around 1,500, and there's some examples here. They're all different to a greater or lesser degree, and they all do quite significantly different things. So, for instance, Litecoin down there is designed to be a very low transaction cost cryptocurrency for making small value transactions, which is something that Bitcoin has been criticized for not enabling very well. Dash and Zcash, on the other hand, are designed to strengthen the level of anonymity that's available to users because it's been found subsequently that Bitcoin actually isn't anywhere near as anonymous as people once thought. And Ethereum is totally different in that it's essentially a digital commodity. So owning Ether tokens is basically a way of allowing you to use the Ethereum blockchain to build things on top of, and it's designed with that in mind. But it's worth being aware that this is not a small marketplace. Nearly 40 cryptocurrencies have a market capitalization of over $1 billion each. So, there's a lot of money in this ecosystem. And without going into too much detail here, although it's something I'm happy to talk to people about later if they're interested, I think there are a couple of key things in terms of positives and negatives for civil society and philanthropy. So in terms of opportunities, there's a very simple opportunity to tap into a new pool of wealth. A lot of people have made significant amounts of money through cryptocurrency simply by getting into it early and then finding that as the value of it went up, they were sitting on unexpected, very large pools of money. And these are probably non-traditional donors, and therefore I think there's a real opportunity to try and tap into that marketplace and convince them to fund good causes, although there are some challenges, I think, to doing that. And another opportunity, I think, is owning and using cryptocurrency is one way of getting the wider benefits of blockchain, which I'll come on to in a minute, although it's important to say that it's not necessary to own cryptocurrency in order to use blockchain. There are other ways of harnessing that technology. And then in terms of the challenges, some of these I think present fairly major barriers. So one is simply technical know-how. Cryptocurrency is quite a complicated marketplace. It's very fast-moving. There's a lot of technical jargon. Some of that is by design because the people in the marketplace want to make it seem complicated and exclusive, I think. But it is a challenge, I think, for philanthropic organizations and civil society organizations to navigate that and to understand what is going on and what the risks are. And in terms of those risks, I think there are two key ones that need to be borne in mind. One is volatility. So cryptocurrency is remarkably volatile. So even though over time the value of lots of these currencies has gone up significantly, so they look like attractive investments, it's also it goes down again just as quickly, and on a day-by-day basis, sometimes they see 20% increases or drops in value. So it's very hard to see how they're appropriate assets for most civil society organizations to be holding at this point in time. And then I think also there are some quite practical considerations around international financial regulations, so things like anti-money laundering and know your customer requirements, because some of these cryptocurrencies by design make it difficult to know who people are, and so if you're receiving donations in cryptocurrency, there may be challenges in terms of knowing who those donors are and meeting the requirements. Although it should also be said that actually in the future it might be easier to meet AML and KYC requirements using cryptocurrency, because at least in theory they are more traceable than normal money. This is something that people in the regulatory world and law enforcement are grappling with at the moment. So expecting civil society organizations to be ahead of that curve seems unrealistic to me at the moment. Just in terms of wider blockchain technology, what I want to do without talking at all really about how it works, because I'm not sure that's particularly helpful in the time that we have here, I just want to outline some of the key features of that and what it tells you about what the technology might be able to do. So firstly, as I've said, it's distributed. It's not held in a single place by a trusted third party. It's distributed across all of the people who use the system. It's public, so anyone can download the blockchain and look through all of the transactions. It has to be said there are an increasing number of private blockchains, so it's not always true that it's entirely public, but let's assume here for the sake of argument that we're talking about something like the Bitcoin blockchain, which is public. It's immutable, and this is important in the sense that once you put a piece of information on a blockchain, it's very difficult, because of the way the mathematics works, to go back and change it, and that is part of what makes it so trustworthy. It's secure, both because of that immutability and because it's public, so if you tried to change something, people would be able to see it, and also because it's distributed, so there's no single point of attack, unlike a traditional system where somebody like an organization like Equifax, for instance, was responsible for holding vast amounts of customer data. A single successful hack on that organization resulted in enormous amounts of that data being lost. On a blockchain-based system, for instance, even if somebody successfully attacked and took down one bit of the network, copies of the whole record would be kept all in lots of other places across the network, so it wouldn't really make any difference. It's universal in the sense that it allows potentially a very high degree of interoperability. So basically what I mean there is you can record all sorts of different things on a blockchain. You can record financial assets, non-financial assets, physical assets using tokens, or entirely digital assets. Even totally intangible things like intellectual property are things that have been recorded on blockchains, and it can allow you to have a single record that moves between all of those seamlessly. And then finally, another element of that seamlessness is that it's inherently digital. So a blockchain is not a digital version of an offline record. It is something that is built on digital principles from the underlying cryptography, and that allows you to do some interesting things in terms of creating new types of assets. And then just to reiterate what that allows you to do and the things that I'm just going to run through in the next section. What does it allow? So decentralization and disintermediation, so taking middlemen out of systems. Radical transparency, and I'll touch on what I mean by that in a slide in a moment. Smart contracts, I'll explain what those are in a bit, but essentially they are a type of computer program that is self-executing, so you can set up conditions, and so if certain things happen, then the program runs itself automatically, and blockchain allows you an infrastructure on which to do that, and this is quite a powerful tool. As I mentioned just on the last slide, assets and value of all kinds can be recorded, and this potentially raises some quite interesting opportunities for philanthropy. And then finally, it can transform the governance of organizations. So let's just have a quick look in a bit more detail at each of those. So in terms of the possibilities, the first one, disintermediation. So as I say, blockchain is a technology that fundamentally is about taking the middle out of systems. So if you do that, for instance, in a long supply chain in an international development context, you can potentially massively reduce the transaction costs that come from legal fees or having to have FX costs as things move between different elements of the chain. And this is somewhere where people are looking at applying blockchain quite successfully to make it much easier and more cost effective to move money around the world. It can also allow disintermediation of the act of charitable giving by enabling things like direct cash transfers at a much greater scale than they are now. So we're already seeing organizations like Give Directly allowing people to give directly to other individuals in other parts of the world. But that is still a system based on having a particular intermediary doing it. Blockchain potentially allows for the same sort of thing, but without any Give Directly or another organization in the middle, and you would just instead have donors and beneficiaries on the ground interacting peer-to-peer. And some people would argue that this would allow you to increase trust because you are able potentially to reduce the risk of fraud or malgovernance by taking links out of the chain, and so there are less chances for bad actors to cause problems in those contexts. And in terms of that question of trust, one of the other big opportunities that blockchain brings is around transparency, and this is where a lot of the focus has been so far in terms of applying blockchain to philanthropy and civil society. So the reason really is that objects or items on a blockchain are unique and they are non-fungible. So unlike traditional cash, for instance, where if I have $10 and someone else has $10 and they're on a digital system, if we send each other those $10, nobody would ever know. It doesn't make any difference. They're essentially fungible from the point of view of the system. With a cryptocurrency or another blockchain-based asset, that's not true. If I had a single Bitcoin and someone else did and we swapped them, you would be able to see that because they are unique digital objects. The application of this to philanthropy is that you can potentially use it to track individual money flows, so donations perhaps into civil society organizations and non-profits, and track them all the way through to see how they're used and spent. Those who are in favor of this would argue that this will increase trust in those organizations and in wider charitable giving. I think there are some big challenges. We all know that it's already quite difficult often to justify spending on things like core costs when donors see those as unnecessary overheads. And if a donor is able to see literally exactly what their donation is spent on, I think that problem could get much more severe in the future. There are also, I think, some concerns about the circumstances in which either a donor or a beneficiary has a very justifiable case for remaining anonymous. So an example I often hear cited is if you are a funder giving to organizations in a country like Uganda where homosexuality is illegal and you're giving to groups who support rights issues around that, the last thing you would want is for the government to be able to identify all of the groups or even individuals that were receiving money from your organization because they would have a list of people to go and lock up. And I think this is a valid concern. Another possibility that I've mentioned a couple of times is that you can create lots of new types of assets. So one of those is cryptocurrencies themselves. These are attempts to create entirely new forms of money through mathematics and technology, which is quite amazing when you think about it. But that goes far beyond traditional money. So the picture there, you may wonder what that is. That's a thing called a crypto kitty, because somebody invented a way of making unique digital objects on the Ethereum blockchain for the first time, which is technically a very exciting thing and could have massive ramifications. But the first thing that anybody used it to do was create these small collectible cats. which is obviously a bit silly, but it should also be said demonstrates something quite important, because it immediately created a new marketplace, and these things trade for quite large amounts of money. So far, the most expensive CryptoKitty sold for $130,000, and the reason is that they are unique digital objects, and that's quite a new concept, because up to this point the problem with digital objects has been that they can be reproduced or copied and then disseminated much more widely, so it was very hard for them to hold any scarcity value. But these new kinds of objects can, so people are willing to pay large amounts of money for them. And I think whilst CryptoKitties are quite silly, we're going to see much more meaningful new types of digital assets created in coming years. Just to go through a couple of the other possibilities here. So around smart contracts, I won't go into in any great detail, but as I mentioned, they are self-executing computer protocols that when certain defined conditions are met, they do certain things. So it's basically if X happens, do Y. And there's a very wide range of applications in all sorts of different industries, including philanthropy. New governance models, again, it's difficult to go into this in a huge amount of detail here. It's something I've written quite a lot about elsewhere if anybody is particularly interested. But in very broad terms, one of the things that you can do with blockchain is not just decentralize systems, but you can decentralize the governance of individual organizations. So instead of having a kind of a traditional centralized structure to make it possible to make decisions effectively and to make logistics possible, you can use the technology to coordinate much looser networks of people working together and kind of create incentive mechanisms to make them work towards a common goal. And this potentially could be, I think, a challenge to the idea of a traditional civil society organization, or at least raises the question, what is it about centralized structures that offer value? And this is not just theoretical. There is at least one philanthropic distributed autonomous organization already out there called Giveth.io, which is doing some very interesting work. And then finally, just a more pragmatic one, the fact that blockchains are publicly accessible and the record is self-maintaining because the transactions automatically update when they happen means that you could have real-time financial information and you wouldn't necessarily need to separately audit it. So that's quite a big deal in terms of non-profit finances. And then this is just a recap, really, of some of those with a specific look at a specific focus on kind of international context. So I've touched on real-time financial information and audit. As I mentioned earlier, actually, some of this technology can enable enhanced checks on things like anti-money laundering. The technology is very good, and one of its strongest use cases is to allow different organizations or individuals to act together where they don't really have a need to trust each other, because the technology allows trustless coordination. And also, it's very good for coordination across networks where you need to be able to have multiple different parties able to enter information and to update the central record. And you don't need to have separate reconciliation processes, for instance. And then in terms of the challenges, again, I mentioned earlier, volatility when it comes to cryptocurrency is a big challenge. Regulation, not so much because these things are harshly regulated, but because there's very little clarity at the moment about how they are going to be regulated, because the technology is developing so fast that the regulation is struggling to keep pace, and also it's different regulators in different jurisdictions are taking different approaches. I think one of the key challenges for civil society organizations in terms of making blockchain work in practice is this one here, this last mile challenge. it's all very well setting up complicated systems based on blockchain or any other technology, but if all they allow you to do is move money or to kind of coordinate within the bit that the technology is able to control, that's no good if you then have a last mile challenge in terms of getting money or support out to the organizations on the ground. And if they aren't also able to access the technology, then it's entirely pointless. And I think this is a challenge a lot of projects are finding at the moment, and having to find ways to adapt and overcome that. And then a very pragmatic challenge for anybody who wants to get involved in blockchain in civil society context is just choosing which platform to use. There are a growing number of blockchains out there, all claiming to be the best one for this, that, and the other. And it's hard to pick between them. There's a lot of confusion in that world. So I think no one in the civil society space should be rushing to do this, and there's a lot more to be done to help civil society organizations navigate this space. I'm just going to come on now to a different technology, and again, I'm not going to go into it in a huge amount of detail, but I want to apply the same lens that we did earlier in terms of questions that I think the technology raises. And it raises quite different questions, I think, artificial intelligence, because it's a much more wide-ranging technology with much deeper societal implications. Just as a bit of context, it's worth saying, artificial intelligence has been around since at least the mid-1950s in one form or another. But over the last few years, there has been an absolutely enormous growth and development, both in terms of the technology, but also interest in it. And there's a couple of key factors it's worth being aware of that have played into that growth. So one is that the algorithms, so the decision processes that underpin the technology, have become much more powerful. And again, I won't go into the kind of technicality of what's changed there. Number two is that the amount of data available for these algorithms to learn from and work on has got much greater as we all increasingly interact online and produce video and photographic images and interact with each other on social media. So it's much easier to train these things in the first place. The hardware required to make them run as fast as they need to has also had a massive step change. And then as a combination of all of these things, there's been a huge amount more investment. It's worth just saying as well what it is that people are generally talking about when they talk about artificial intelligence, because it can be quite confusing. It is not artificial general intelligence in the sense of machines that are in any way comparable with humans across the full range of different capabilities. We're basically nowhere nearer that than we were in 1955. What we're talking about is narrow or domain-specific AI, so artificial intelligences that are very good at doing specific set tasks. So, for instance, there is now an AI that can beat any human player at the ancient game of Go, but we haven't got Blade Runner-style androids yet. And some people think that artificial general intelligence is just theoretically impossible and we will never have it. Just in very top-level terms, I think some of the key themes around the impact that AI will have on civil society. So on organizations themselves, I think there's a whole sort of pragmatic thing around the automation of processes within organizations. And that can be things from quite mundane data handling to analyzing all of the information in terms of assessing grants. So increasingly complicated processes can now be automated using some of the current forms of machine learning. The application of chatbots is something we're seeing a lot of in the commercial space, and non-profits are starting to use them too, to provide advice services and to interact with supporters and donors. And going back to what I said right at the beginning, the direct application of the technology to further the mission. There are some really interesting examples, particularly in medical research and conservation, of applying machine learning to very large data sets to find new interventions that are more effective than any we've had before. And then just in terms of the wider impact of AI and the impact on civil society. So one is that AI is a technology that is going to just become commonplace in all of our lives over the coming years. We already use, our phones all the time, and increasingly people are starting to use conversational interfaces like Apple's Siri or Amazon Alexa or Google Home. And these are all underpinned by artificial intelligence. So we're actually interacting with AI all the time without necessarily knowing it, and that will start to influence the way we make decisions. The AI as a technology, I think, will have an impact on many of the people and communities that we as civil society organizations are trying to serve. So just to take one example, we are already aware that there is a big problem around algorithmic bias. And this, in a very broad and short terms, is the problem whereby if you have a automated decision procedure, even if it itself has no bias, if you put it to work and let it learn on data sets that contain historic bias for things like gender or race, it very quickly starts to exhibit those biases and even strengthen them over time. And there have been lots of examples already, for instance, in the US, where they've used algorithmic processes to determine bail conditions. They have started to develop very strong racial biases very quickly because of the data they were working on. And this is a huge problem I think we're going to see over the next few years. And then one other that I think we're just starting to see the beginnings of now is the application of AI to the allocation of philanthropic resources, which I'm just going to go into in a little bit more detail in the next couple of slides. So I think there are a couple of ways in which we're going to see this play out. The first one we're starting to see already, and the next one I think we will see in the next year or two. So one is to take the model that's already used by commercial organizations like Facebook or Amazon, where they make recommendations to you of things you might be interested in based on your past behavior or preferences or what your peer group likes. So this is essentially, if you like a charity like Cancer Research UK, maybe you'll love this other charity, and you will. We are already seeing Facebook has enabled charitable giving through its Facebook Messenger service, and it employs recommendations of this type. And similarly, Amazon has enabled donations through its voice-operated Alexa assistant, and it's likely to do a similar thing. And then the different model is something that I've chosen to call a philgorithm, which is where instead of that kind of approach based on your past behavior, it's a much more objective matching based on analysis of social and environmental needs data and social impact data on organizations and interventions to find the most effective ways of meeting the most pressing needs at any given time. And I often, when I raise this as a possibility, people say, well, I don't think that that's anything more than theoretical, because you can never remove the element of heart from charitable giving, and this sounds horribly cold and rational, and I agree to some extent. I think the reason I think it is a possibility that we need to pay attention to, I think there's two reasons. Firstly, as I've said before, we're going to become very used to relying on AI in all sorts of other areas of our life, and it's going to start seeming odd if we can't also ask questions about which are the most effective charities to give to, or where we should be putting our philanthropic money in the future. The other area is that in the future, I think there are going to be quite a lot of contexts in which lots of money is changing hands without human involvement, and the only way to get some of that money to charity or to civil society effectively will be to find ways of doing it without human oversight too. Um, the reason I say this, perhaps going back to the mention earlier of the Internet of Things, is that many experts who are interested in that area think that what is likely to happen as this network of smart objects grows is that increasingly they will be able to generate their own revenue and to spend some of that revenue on their own maintenance. For instance, an autonomous vehicle, a car, might be able to sell off some of its spare capacity and give rides to people, or some of its processor capacity, then spend that money taking itself to a garage to get fixed. And there is the potential in this system, if there are small amounts of money spare, to get some of that to charity. And I think the only practical way of doing that would be to have an automated system based on AI of some sort. Just to show that I really have thought about this, here's an infographic that I did a couple of years ago in CAF about how a philanthropic washing machine might work. And if anybody is interested, I can also send them a mock-up of an instruction manual that we did as well. And then just to touch on a couple of other sort of cross-cutting themes before we bring this section to a close. It's not a technology in itself, but as I said earlier, I think data, as I say, is, the Economist says there, the most valuable resource in the world and the new oil. And a technology like artificial intelligence, for instance, fundamentally requires vast amounts of data. And not only does it require the amounts to be large, it requires it to be, open, so not locked away in silos in the public sector or in the commercial sector. And also it has to be in a usable and consistent and clean format. And I think there will be a big challenge for philanthropic and civil society organizations in the coming years to make sure that they are recording data and using it in such a way that it lends itself to machine learning applications. And then another thing I just want to touch on, because I think there's some fascinating stuff going on in this area, and it's very relevant to a lot of the issues around rights that civil society focuses on. So identity is still one of the very big challenges online, because it's very hard to know that somebody is who they say they are when you're interacting with them online. But some quite significant changes are coming for a number of reasons. One is in terms of getting people onto online in the first place, developments in things like biometrics and facial recognition could make that process much quicker and more accurate. And then in terms of the model of who owns data, which I think is extremely pressing at the moment, given what we're seeing with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, one of the intriguing ideas is the idea of self-sovereign identity, where you use a technology, potentially like blockchain, to shift the model of ownership of identity away from the current one, where we as individuals rely on lots of different external agencies, governments and companies and Facebook and others to hold different aspects of our online identity for us, to a model where we as individuals own all of those different aspects, and we are able to disclose only the ones that we want to in any given circumstance. So we take control of that online identity. And this raises one additional intriguing possibility, which is in the future, instead of companies like Facebook using our personal data to make enormous amounts of money, we could charge them to use that data and thereby monetize our own personal data. And there's some very interesting work being done around that at the moment. And then just to bring things to a close, just to kind of reiterate things in a thematic way, because we've talked about specific technologies here. Some of the key cross-cutting themes, I think, across all of these technologies are things like disintermediation, which we've talked about quite a bit, decentralization, again, related but slightly separate, the idea of radical transparency, whether it's blockchain or another technology. I think there's going to be more of a push for this kind of transparency in future. the idea of entirely new kinds of digital-only assets, increasing reliance and focus on data-driven automated decision-making, a whole debate about data ownership, interfaces that are underpinned by algorithms and AI and making decisions on that basis, and wholly new types of digital identity. And just at the end is some detail about where to find more on the sort of stuff we've been talking about today. And I think at that point, that's the end of the presentation, so I'm ready for any questions.
Rodri, thank you so much for your presentation. We have a first question, which is coming from Chet, who is asking, who is on the cutting edge of using blockchain in philanthropy?
Yeah, good question. I mean, there's a couple of, well, I'd say a few things. So a lot of the most successful examples so far have probably been big international aid agencies. So the World Food Programme, for instance, has done some interesting work in some of its camps using blockchain for food vouchers. Similarly, bits of the UN and UNICEF have done some good work. If you want a good overview of where some of the most meaningful implementations of blockchain have been in this context so far, I'd recommend a report that came out just last week, actually, from Stanford Business School that I can share a link to after this, but it's a really good overview of the current state of blockchain in the kind of philanthropy and civil society context.
Great. We have another one from Jesse. Disintermediation. Intermediaries are often doing a lot more than just serving as a vehicle to transfer funds. They're also conducting significant due diligence upfront on the charity that the donor may not do. Are you saying that this disintermediation is a positive thing in this scenario?
Yeah, it's a really good question, particularly because I think when I started talking about blockchain in about 4 years ago, in this context, I probably slightly naively thought, oh yeah, that's great. It'll be more empowering for donors, and you'll get rid of intermediation. And I guess over time, I've probably come back more in the other direction, again to thinking, I'm not sure that is necessarily entirely positive, because I think there are already challenges with donors having too much power and control in a lot of contexts. And also in terms of the point you make, I think intermediation is too often portrayed as just being about, adding layers of complexity and cost, whereas actually, when it's done well, particularly by civil society organizations, the point is to add real meaningful value. I guess where I've come around to thinking is it's worth being, even if you don't unquestioningly think it's a good thing to do it, it's worth being aware that a technology like blockchain enables it because somebody else is probably going to do it. And also it raises an interesting challenge, which is, okay, if you can do these things in a disintermediated way, what is it about your intermediated or centralized way that definitely does add value? And there probably is a lot, but it just kind of forces you to be much clearer about what that value is.
Great. We have about 2 more questions. I think time for 2 more questions. How do you think technology can bring philanthropists closer to where their donation is spent?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think there are various ways. I mean, if the positive side of the question we just had is that actually if in some circumstances donors like the thought of interacting more directly with the people, who are the end beneficiaries of their donation, so more of a kind of direct giving model, then a technology like blockchain can enable that to happen at an unprecedented scale. I think there are also some possibilities with technologies we haven't really talked about so much today, like virtual and augmented reality, which are there's some interesting examples of those being used both in fundraising and in awareness raising by nonprofits to kind of give people empathetic experiences to give a sense of how their money is being spent. So I think there are a lot of possibilities there. I guess I would still caveat it by saying that you need to be careful about just assuming that bringing philanthropists closer to where their donation is spent is always good if you aren't aware of the risks of things like just giving those donors more control at the expense of the people or organizations on the ground.
And our last question is, how would you recommend conditioning NGOs and donors to use these technologies?
Conditioning? No, I guess, so I guess if I'm understanding the question right, it's basically, how, if these things really are a big deal and we should be doing something about them, how can we do that, and how do we kind of overcome some of the cultural issues? I mean, I think there are, significant challenges, and one of the things that we're trying to do with our work on technology and now at CAF is to play more of a role in helping to both to kind of bridge the gap between sort of civil society and charity organizations and the tech industry, and also make sure that civil society has a voice in a lot of the current kind of policy and political debates about technology like AI, because I think their voice is too often missing from those debates, and they have a very important perspective. I mean, I think in terms of the practicalities of how, as an individual organization, you get on board with a lot of these technologies, I think it's probably not time to go into it in a lot of detail here. There are some really good resources out there, and some of them are, very low cost or free. I think there's also, again, we probably don't have time to go into it in detail, that there is a lot of cultural change that needs to be done in helping people in civil society to understand why these issues are relevant to them, and give them the confidence to know that they have something very valuable and important to say about them when they understand the key features and issues.
Hi, Rodri. I think we have one last question that I know I myself have been thinking about, is going back to the beginning of the presentation, is will disruptive technologies reduce or increase inequality? Looking at this question at more of an international context.
So I think there's definitely a kind of utopian version of it, and there's probably a dystopian. I think, it was interesting just this week that the chair of the IMF said that in their view, cryptocurrencies could potentially be very valuable in terms of financial inclusion and reducing financial inequality, and that is, an area where there's been a lot of work. But then I think there are also lots of concerns about the ways in which these technologies could make inequality worse. For instance, the automation of the workplace through robotics and AI will create inequality, I think, both between those who are still in work and those who aren't, between those who understand and own the technology and those who don't, and also between different countries as the pace of the change through automation varies. So I think there will be some countries, sort of emerging economies, that will be hit very hard because more developed economies will have the luxury of adapting to some of that automation quicker. So I think, there are ways in which these technologies can reduce inequality, but it won't happen automatically, which is why I think civil society organizations have to get to grips with the issues so that they can get involved in the political and policy debates now and try and shape the technology so that they hopefully do reduce inequality rather than making it worse.
Thank you, Rodri. On the screen, you'll find some more information about technology and philanthropy, and also where you can hear more from Rodri on this subject. Thank you so much for joining us, Rodri. I know that we learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to the next webinars that we have around the same issue. I wanted to remind everyone on this call today that we have another webinar tomorrow for WING about the Barcelona meeting that just happened with funders. So if you're interested in hearing a little bit about what happened then, I invite you to join the call tomorrow. You can email me to register, or you can register directly on our blog or our website. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Rodri.
Thanks very much. Bye, everybody.